Hello, class. Today's topic is the poetry of William Shakespeare. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at Venus and Adonis, as well as the sonnets of 1609. We're going to start with Venus and Adonis. Here's the title page for the 1593 edition of the poem. 1593 was a difficult year, particularly for folks in the theater. There was an outbreak of plague, and the theaters were closed, and that may be one that may have been a motive for Shakespeare to seek out another source of revenue, since the theaters were closed, probably indefinitely. They could be closed for months or even years as a result of these outbreaks of plague. Venus and Adonis was the first work by Shakespeare to appear in print. Only one copy of the first quarto edition has survived, and again, that's what you see here on the screen. But the poem was immensely popular in Shakespeare's lifetime, with at least 8 more editions appearing before his death in 1616. So I want to talk about this Latin epigraph on the title page. It is important. The translation of it is, "Let base conceited wits admire vile things. Fair Phoebus, lead me to the Muses' springs." This is Marlowe's translation of a passage from Ovid's Amores, and let's talk about that. So this Latin epigraph, like I said, it comes from Ovid's Amores. This was a collection of erotic elegies about the poet's love for a woman who in many respects resembles the cruel, aloof, inaccessible mistresses of the later Petrarchan sonnet tradition. And Marlowe had translated all 3 books of the Amores, probably in the late 1580s. And this was the first translation of these poems in any modern vernacular language, although they were not published during Marlowe's lifetime. He died in 1593, the same year that Venus and Adonis was published, and his translation came out sometime after that. And it was quite controversial. In 1599, printed copies were publicly burned by ecclesiastical order. So interesting that Shakespeare would choose an epigraph from Ovid's Amores for his Venus and Adonis, his first public poem. There are several reasons why he might have done this. In the first place, Ovid is frank in his treatment of sexual subject matter. That's in part what led to the burning of Marlowe's translations of the Amores in 1599. And Shakespeare's poem was certainly risque for its time, and we'll take a closer look at some of those passages. Some of those erotic passages later. But perhaps more importantly, Ovid handles the conventions of Latin love elegy with playfulness and humor, as does Shakespeare in his handling of the conventions of Petrarchan love poetry in Venus and Adonis. And finally, and perhaps most obviously, Ovid's Metamorphoses was the primary source for the Venus and Adonis myth for Renaissance artists and poets, including Spenser, whose Garden of Adonis episode in Book 3 of The Faerie Queene had appeared 3 years before Shakespeare's poem. So here is the dedication page to Venus and Adonis, and you'll notice that Shakespeare has signed that dedication. And this is important because Shakespeare's name was not attached to the publication of any of his plays until Burby's 1598 edition, quarto edition of Love's Labour's Lost. So the fact that Shakespeare signed his name to the dedicatory epistle of Venus and Adonis 5 years earlier indicates, among other things, poetry's cachet as a marker of cultural prestige and social respectability. In the early 1590s, the writing of plays was regarded as a business venture. Their purpose was to make money for the companies that owned them, that is, owned the plays. The most viable path to individual recognition and status as a poet was to secure the patronage of a wealthy aristocrat by writing poems that appealed to the tastes, sensibilities, and ideological bearings of the ruling elite. So this dedication to Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, let's talk a little bit about him. There he is, just a delightful portrait of him. I love the gauntlets he's wearing, the gloves, just fantastic. And the armor is beautiful. He's wearing the gorget under his lace collar. It's just beautiful armor with all of these grotesque intertwinings of serpent figures, and you can see them on his helmet there behind his right arm. And the cuirass sitting on the floor behind him. He was a controversial figure, not in 1593, but he was implicated in the 1601 Essex Rebellion and was imprisoned in the Tower of London until Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603. Not much is known about Shakespeare's relationship with Wriothesley. Shakespeare dedicated 2 poems to him, a Venus and Adonis in 1593, and then a year later, The Rape of Lucrece. Some have identified Wriothesley as the fair youth addressed in the Sonnets. We'll talk more about that a little later in this lecture. He was only 19 years old when Venus and Adonis went to press. Wriothesley was already well known in court circles and provided encouragement and financial support to other aspiring poets besides Shakespeare. And despite the self-effacing and supplicatory tone of the dedicatory epistle, Shakespeare was using Wriothesley's name to raise his poetic profile and advance his career. So let's talk about Venus and Adonis as an epyllion. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and call it the Petrarchan epic, because we're really reading it in the context of the Petrarchan sonnet tradition in this class. So let's talk about the poem, just a little general introduction of the poem. Again, I provide my lecture notes for you. You can either just listen or pause and read if you'd like. Venus and Adonis is composed in sestorima stanzas, that is 6-line stanzas rhyming A, B, A, B, C, C. This is a pattern that we've seen before. It was used by Thomas Lodge and Rosalind in 1590, and then much earlier by Spenser in the Shepherd's Calendar in the January Eclogue, 1579. It's the date of the Shepherd's Calendar. Due to Shakespeare's facility with the form, however, it has come to be known simply as the Venus and Adonis stanza. With its quatrain and rhyming couplet, it closely resembles the 7-line rhyme royal stanza A, B, A, B, B, C, C. However, whereas rhyme royal was associated with weightier tragic subject matter, Chaucer had used it to great effect in his epic Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare seems to prefer the 6-line sestorima as more appropriate for his playful and at times funny erotic poem. A year after Venus and Adonis, He followed up with the grave labor that he'd promised Risley in the dedicatory epistle, the Rape of Lucrece, which is composed in rhyme royal. So the epyllion, or mini-epic, is a type of narrative poem that was popular during the late Roman Republic, the 1st century BCE. The most celebrated example of the epyllion comes from Catullus and is written in the dactylic hexameter lines typically reserved for epic poetry. However, rather than recounting grandiose Homeric narratives of divinely refereed warfare and arduous journeys, Catullus uses the verse form to treat romantic subject matter. His poem briefly tells the story of the marriage of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. These are the parents of the Greek hero Achilles, although over half its lines recount the Minoan princess Ariadne's desertion by her Athenian lover Theseus. This is woven into a marriage blanket that is given to Peleus and Thetis. So Catullus's reputation for erotic wit, a number of his surviving lyrics are addressed to a mistress named Lesbia. This made his poetry especially attractive to classically educated Renaissance poets writing within the later Petrarchan tradition. Besides Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, we have epyllia from several of his contemporaries, including Christopher Marlowe, Hero and Leander, and Michael Drayton's Endymion and Phoebe. So I call it a Petrarchan epic, Venus and Adonis, a Petrarchan epic, as Shakespeare playfully adapts the conventions of classical epic to amorous subject matter. Just like Catullus, in the poems of Homer and Virgil, the epic poems of Homer and Virgil, divine beings intervene in the lives of mortals and often have a direct hand in shaping their destinies. In Shakespeare's poem, Venus interacts with the mortal Adonis, but is unable to bend him to her will and is powerless to alter the tragic outcome of his choices. Shakespeare also emulates his forebear's penchant for formulaic epithets like the rose-cheeked Adonis and sick-thoughted Venus of the opening stanza of the poem. You might think of Homer's rosy-fingered Dawn or swift-footed Achilles as an epic precedent for these kinds of epithets. There are epic similes, too, like Shakespeare's comparison of Venus to a rapacious bird of prey, lines 55 to 60, or his comparison of her eyes to the tender horns of a snail when she discovers the mangled body of Adonis towards the end of the poem. And then finally, another epic feature of Venus and Adonis is Shakespeare's proclivity of his epic characters toward long declamatory speeches, which is replicated in Venus's impassioned harangues to Adonis. So besides the poetry of Catullus and Ovid, Shakespeare was clearly conscious of the influence of Petrarch on the English sonnet tradition. Sidney's Astrophil and Stella had appeared in 1591, followed almost immediately by Daniel's Delia sequence. By the time he was writing Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare may have already sensed that the conventions of Petrarchan love poetry had become a little shop-worn and stale, and that they might benefit from an infusion of levity, which he achieves in Venus and Adonis in part by swapping the gender roles, making Venus the sexually assertive, psychologically tormented and frustrated, bold-faced suitor, while Adonis becomes the eminently beautiful but callous and aloof love object, frosty in desire. Nowhere in the poem, however, does Shakespeare engage more directly with the conventions of Petrarchan love than in his very funny description of Adonis's palfrey breaking loose to pursue an elusive mare. He stamps and snorts, curvets and leaps, alternating between hot courage and melancholy malcontent, while the mare, for her part, spurns at his love and scorns the heat he feels, beating his kind embracements with her heels. In another reversal of Petrarchan norms in this section of the poem, Shakespeare gives the stallion, not the mare, a very brisk blazon, and you can look at that in lines 289 to 300. So rather than going through this very long poem chronologically, I've decided to talk about it using these four themes. And these themes obviously overlap in various ways, but I use them to identify certain passages. And while I am going through discussing each of these themes, I'll be reading some passages from the poem, and I'll point them out to you if you would like to follow along in your textbook, because I will not be putting the passages on screen. So we'll talk first about passing time. So the story of Venus and Adonis unfolds over the course of a single day. While Venus seems oblivious to the passing hours, Adonis often remarks on the time of day. Lying fastened in her arms, he complains of the midday heat. He says, "The sun doth burn my face, I must remove." At dusk, he observes the sheep gone to fold, birds to their nest, and later expresses his fear of traveling by foot through the dark. He experiences time with a sense of urgency that Venus, being herself immortal, does not feel. She is a divine being, the powerful embodiment of an eternal idea, love. He, a mere mortal, is tender, described as infantile at times, immature, undeveloped. Love is not yet in season for Adonis. I know not love, he says, unless it be a boar, and then I chase it. He protests that he is yet too green for love in two significant passages, lines 415 to 20 and lines 523 to 528. And I will read those lines, the second set of lines, 523 to 28. "Fair queen," quoth he, "if any love you owe me, measure my strangeness with my unripe years. Before I know myself, seek not to know me. No fisher but the ungrown fry forbears. The mellow plum doth fall, the green sticks fast, or being early plucked is sour to taste." While Venus dwells on the present moment and the pleasures that it offers, Adonis craves experience, growth, and change. And it is this restless quality in him that is incompatible with Venus's erotic inertia. It makes him at once astonishingly beautiful to her and acutely vulnerable, as Venus herself recognizes in lines 727 to 50. And I'll read just a portion of those lines here. "And therefore hath she, that is Cynthia, the goddess who is jealous of Adonis's beauty," and this is Venus speaking here, "therefore hath she bribed the destinies to cross the curious workmanship of nature, to mingle beauty with infirmities, and pure perfection with impure defeature, making it subject to the tyranny of mad mischances and much misery. As burning fevers, agues pale and faint, life-poisoning pestilence and frenzies would, the marrow-eating sickness whose attaint disorder breeds by heating of the blood, surfeits, imposthumes, grief and damned despair, swear nature's death for framing thee so fair. And not the least of all these maladies, and Venus is talking about the boar here, that Adonis is going to hunt and which will eventually kill him. And not the least of all these maladies, but in 1 minute's fight brings beauty under. Both favor, savor, hue, and qualities, whereat the impartial gazer late did wonder, are on the sudden wasted, thawed, and done, as mountain snow melts with the midday sun. The theme of generative nature. Venus may not fully understand what motivates Adonis internally, but she grasps with perfect clarity the temporality of his physical being. She avails herself, in fact, of his mortality to stress the urgency with which he should yield to her desire. She makes a carpe diem appeal. Make use of time, let not advantage slip. Beauty within itself should not be wasted. And she repeatedly reminds him that despite his rebuffs, he is still a creature of sexual appetite. After his horse breaks loose in mad pursuit of the mare that wanders into the scene of their colloquy, she offers a lesson on natural law, a law that applies as much to Adonis as to any beast. This is lines 385 to 408. Thy palfrey, she's speaking here, as he should, welcomes the warm approach of sweet desire. Affection is a coal that must be cooled, else suffered it will set the heart on fire. The sea hath bounds, but deep desire hath none. Therefore no marvel, though thy horse be gone. How like a jade he stood, tied to the trees, servilely mastered with a leathern rein. But when he saw his love, his youth's fair fee, he held such petty bondage in disdain, throwing the base thong from his bending crest, enfranchising his mouth, his back, his breast. Who sees his true love in her naked bed, teaching the sheets a whiter hue than white, but when his glutton eyes so full hath fed, his other agents aim at like delight. Who is so faint that dares not be so bold to touch the fire, the weather being cold? Let me excuse thy courser, gentle boy, and learn of him, I heartily beseech thee, to take advantage on presented joy. Though I were dumb, yet his proceedings teach thee. O learn to love, the lesson is but plain, and once made perfect, never lost again. More than once, Venus, argues that it is Adonis's duty to propagate future generations of men. This is an argument that Shakespeare makes to the fair youth in his sonnets. There are a couple of instances of this in lines 163 to 79, and then again in lines 751 to 68, which he dismisses as her idle, overhandled theme. We're going to take a look at the second of those passages, lines 751 to 68. I'm going to read just a portion of them here. And again, this is Venus speaking to Adonis. What is thy body but a swallowing grave, seeming to bury that posterity which by the rights of time thou needs must have, if thou destroy them not in dark obscurity? If so, the world will hold thee in disdain, sith in thy pride so fair a hope is slain. So in thyself art made away, a mischief worse than civil homebred strife, or theirs whose desperate hands themselves do slay, or butcher's sire that reaves his son of life. Foul cankering rust the hidden treasure frets, but gold that's put to use more gold begets. So moving on now to love and lust. Adonis rejects Venus's argument, the one that we just looked at, that makes Adonis says, reason the bawd to lust's abuse. He's just not buying her arguments. And he draws a distinction between love's gentle spring and sweating lust. And despite Adonis's rather sanctimonious confutation of Venus's argument, Shakespeare seems to delight more in erotic description and double entendre than moral expostulation. Most Elizabethan readers would never have encountered something so explicit as when Venus offers her naked body to Adonis in lines 229 to 240. This is a description that is so ingenious in euphemism, metaphoric euphemism, that even the prudish Adonis smiles as in disdain. I'm going to read a portion of it here. She's much stronger than Adonis. Earlier she snatches him from his horse and carries him under her arm. A very funny image. And so she's speaking to him here. She's basically forced him down. Fondling, she saith, since I have hemmed thee here within the circuit of this ivory pale, I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or in dale. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower, where the pleasant fountains lie. Within this limit is relief enough, sweet bottom grass and high delightful plain, round rising hillocks, breaks obscure and rough, to shelter thee from tempest and from rain. Then be my dear, since I am such a park, no dog shall rouse thee, though 1,000 bark. Later, after Adonis announces that he intends to hunt a boar, Venus half swoons and sinketh down, still hanging by his neck, he on her belly, she on her back. Experiencing, as they go down together, Venus does, a fleeting moment of gratification that Shakespeare ensures the reader remains entirely imaginary, a tantalizing fantasy of sexual union. And this is described from lines 595 to 604. Now is she in the very lists of love, her champion mounted for the hot encounter. All is imaginary she doth prove. He will not manage her, although he mount her. That worse than Tantalus is her annoy, to clip Elysium, and to lack her joy. Even so, poor birds, deceived with painted grapes, do surfeit it by the eye, and pine the maw. Even so she languisheth in her mishaps, as those poor birds that helpless berries saw. So finally, we will move on to our last theme, cradle and grave. So while Venus imagines a consummation, a sexual consummation that never occurs, she also visualizes, she imagines quite accurately, it turns out, Adonis's approaching death. On his back doth lie an image like thyself, she says, all stained with gore. Death is itself a consummation. Its claim to Adonis's body is scarcely different from the claims of sexual desire. The merging together of sex and death becomes explicit in a fantasy that is as perverse as it is grotesque, that concludes with Venus picturing herself with the fatal tusks of the boar. And this passage, very interesting passage, starts at line 1109 and continues through 1122. Venus is talking here about the boar. If he did see his face, that is, if the boar saw Adonis's face, why then I know he thought to kiss him, and hath killed him so. 'Tis true, thus was Adonis slain. He ran upon the boar with his sharp spear, who did not whet his teeth at him again, but by a kiss thought to persuade him there, and nuzzling in his flank, the loving swine sheathed unaware the tusk in his soft groin. Had I been toothed like him, I must confess, with kissing him I should have killed him first. But he is dead, and never did he bless my youth with his, the more am I accursed. With this she falleth in the place she stood, and stains her face with his congealed blood. So as Adonis becomes emblematic of the cycle of life and death, the passage of time and seasonal change, Venus becomes increasingly maternal, less a figure of sexual passion than of ministering motherhood. On the morning of the fatal hunt, she refers to Adonis as a son that sucked an earthly mother, and as she searches for him, Shakespeare compares her to a milch doe whose swelling dugs do ache, hasting to feed her fawn hid in some brake. In her grief and rage, she says that love too shall be subject to the vicissitudes of time, part of the cycle of life and death, to bud and be blasted in a breathing while, she says. When Adonis's corpse is transformed into a flower, she is herself transformed into a figure of maternal solicitude. I'm looking specifically at lines 1177 through 88, where her tomb-like bosom is a far cry from the timeless, sheltering deer park of lines 231 to 240. And I'll finish this theme by reading out this passage. Poor flower, quoth she, this was thy father's guise, sweet issue of a more sweet-smelling sire. For every little grief to wet his eyes, to grow unto himself was his desire. And so 'tis thine. But know it is as good to wither in my breast as in his blood. Here was thy father's bed, here in my breast. Thou art the next of blood, and 'tis thy right. Lo, in this hollow cradle take thy rest. My throbbing heart shall rock thee day and night. There shall not be 1 minute in an hour wherein I will not kiss my sweet love's flower. So with that, we will move on now to Shakespeare's sonnets. So here is the title page for the 1609 edition of Shakespeare's Sonnets. Notice Shakespeare's name quite prominent on the title page right at the top. So clearly a very marketable poet by 1609. So they were published in quarto format. The book contains 154 sonnets total, followed by the long poem A Lover's Complaints, 329 lines. And some scholars regard this poem as spurious, as not by Shakespeare. That is open to debate. Most of the sonnets were written between 1592 and 1604. There is credible evidence that many of these poems were circulating in manuscript as early as 1598. And despite the claim on the title page that the poems had never before appeared in print, 2 of the sonnets, 138 and 144, were included in Jaggard's collection, The Passionate Pilgrim, in 1599, along with several of the poems that appeared in Love's Labour's Lost, and I talk about that in my video on that play. So the book was published by Thomas Thorpe, those are his initials there, TT, who had also published works by Marlowe and Ben Jonson. He published Volpone just a couple of years before the sonnets. George Eld was the printer, and William Aspley the bookseller. There was another seller, John Wright, and there's a second state of this title page that was printed for him, whereas he's listed as the seller. So we know of two variants of the title page with 2 different booksellers. So this is the enigmatic dedication page. We'll just read this real quick. I'm going to say a lot of things about it. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet wisheth that well-wishing adventurer in setting forth, Thomas Thorpe. So this dedication page presents something of a riddle that has fascinated and perplexed readers and scholars for centuries. There is general agreement that the well-wishing adventurer is the publisher Thomas Thorpe. As to the identity of Mr. W.H., we really have nothing but tantalizing speculations. So let's explore some of the more popular theories out there. Some believe that Thorpe dedicated the collection to the young man lovingly addressed by Shakespeare in a number of the sonnets, the fair youth. Henry Wriothesley, the dedicatee of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, has been put forward as one possibility, the idea being that to protect his identity, the initials were swapped. So Wriothesley Henry. Another candidate would be Mary Sidney Herbert's son, that is Philip Sidney's sister's son, Philip Sidney's nephew, William Herbert, who was a well-known literary patron in the late 1590s and the early 17th century, and he was, along with his brother Philip, the dedicatee of the 1623 folio of Shakespeare's plays. Both these men, Henry Wriothesley and William Herbert, have been put forward as likely candidates for Mr. W.H. Both of these identifications are defensible, but they also raise difficulties, not the least of which is the use of the prefix master. This is inappropriate to a member of the nobility, and if one accepts the identification of Mr. W.H. as the original addressee of the sonnets, then the identity of our ever-living poet is clearly Shakespeare himself. Another possibility, albeit more prosaic, is that Thorpe simply dedicated the book to Shakespeare, the only begetter of these sonnets, and that the H is simply a compositor's error and was supposed to be an S or perhaps an SH. There are a number of things supporting this. There have been, this was a common compositor's error. It's been observed in other books published by Thorpe. And this theory is also supported by the prefix, which would have been appropriate to Shakespeare's rank. And accepting this identification, then the ever-living poet on the dedication page would be God, not Shakespeare. This solution, although it's the one that I personally favor, it's not entirely satisfying either, and the debate is ongoing. So scholars have traditionally divided the 154 sonnets into two large sections. Sonnets 1 through 126, dedicated to the so-called fair youth, and sonnets 127 to 52, dedicated to the dark lady. We'll talk about both of these in a few minutes. The last two sonnets, 153 and 154, are dedicated to the love god Cupid. It is unclear whether Shakespeare was involved in or even approved the publication of the sonnets, which makes it difficult to draw any definitive conclusions about their sequential arrangement. There have been attempts to identify a through narrative, some of them quite arcane. These have proven ingenious at times, but they are unconvincing. Even the grouping of fair youth and dark lady sonnets is somewhat misleading. since most of the sonnets are not explicitly about either of these individuals. Nevertheless, there are smaller subgroups of poems, like the Cupid poems that I mentioned above, that seem to belong together, and some of these groupings are well known. So, for example, there are 6 so-called love triangle sonnets, 40 through 42, 133, and 134, and 144. And there are 8 so-called rival poet sonnets, 78, 79, and 80, and then 82 through 86. Scholars have also made persuasive claims attributing certain groups of sonnets to different periods in Shakespeare's literary career, and these groupings are based on linguistic, stylistic, and thematic features. For the most part, Shakespeare adheres to the English sonnet format established by Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, the 3 quatrains and a closing couplet, all in iambic pentameter. But there are a few irregularities in Shakespeare's sonnets. So, for example, there's Sonnet 99, which has 15 lines and not 14. Number 126 has only 12, and they're all rhyming couplets. Number 145 is not written in pentameter, but iambic tetrameter. Another noteworthy feature of Shakespeare's sonnets to pay attention to is his penchant for closed quatrains. And we'll take a look at that feature as we get into some of the sonnets. We're going to look at 14 of them in this lecture. I'm going to list them out here. You'll see that I've identified sonnets 3 through 102 as belonging to the group, the Fair Youth sonnets, and then sonnet 127 is the first of the Dark Lady sonnets, and all the sonnets after 128, 130, and 146 belong to the Dark Lady group. 2 of the sonnets here are not in the textbook, and I will put them on screen using the Norton Shakespeare as my source. So we'll start with sonnet number 3. Again, this is one of the Fair Youth sonnets. Many of Shakespeare's sonnets are concerned with the natural process of senescence and dissolution, getting old and dying, and the ways one might carry on loving and perhaps achieve some measure of immortality in despite of death. The solution offered in this sonnet and the one before it, sonnet number 2, is procreation. So here the speaker urges the fair youth to marry and pass on the beauty he has inherited from his mother to his own children. And you'll recall from earlier in this lecture that Venus makes a similar argument to Adonis in Venus and Adonis, lines 157 to 174. And it is possible that both Shakespeare's Apollyon and these poems, these early sonnets, were composed around the same time. This sonnet is typical of Shakespeare's closed quatrain structure. Each quatrain ends with a full stop marking a step in the speaker's argument. If the fair youth chooses not to marry, the couplet reminds him of the grim alternative. Sonnet number 17. Number 17 picks up the theme of procreation yet again in the final couplet, only this time Shakespeare offers another way to overcome mortality, and that is the verse monument. The basic idea here is that poetry works to keep memory alive. But were some child of yours alive that time, you should live twice in it and in my rhyme. So to achieve this goal, the poet needs his beloved to sire offspring that will verify the truth of his verses. Otherwise, as he explains in the second and third quatrains, his poetry will be dismissed as Petrarchan hyperbole, and your true rights be termed a poet's rage and stretched meter of an antique song. So no one will believe that that the addressee of the sonnet was that beautiful, that it's just formulaic Petrarchan language. So if his beloved has a child, that will verify the truth of his beauty. Sonnet number 18. And again, it'd be a good idea to take a look at these ahead of reading my notes here. So sonnet number 18, the notion that the poet confers immortality to the beloved through his verses is conveyed nowhere more beautifully than in this poem, which is one of Shakespeare's best-known sonnets. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, that is his poem, and this gives life to thee. Sonnet number 20. So perhaps no other sonnet by Shakespeare has generated more debate than this one. And this is due largely to its very intriguing sexual ambiguities. Here he praises the fair youth's natural feminine beauty as opposed to false women's fashion. And he calls the fair youth the master mistress of my passion. The queerness of expression is unmistakable. Yet the final quatrain and couplet seem to defeat homoerotic desire, and the speaker distinguishes his love, sort of like Habenel's platonic intellectualized love for Colin Clout in The Shepherd's Calendar, from heterosexual love associated with physical gratification. This is the only sonnet by Shakespeare that uses feminine rhymes exclusively. That is, so each line ends with an extra unstressed syllable. It is also one of his body of sonnets, with frequent puns on male and female genitalia. There's a pun on the word cunt with acquainted, and a pun on penis with the word pricked. And there are others buried in there as well. I'll let you ferret those out. Sonnet 23. It is always noteworthy when Shakespeare makes references to acting and stagecraft, particularly in his non-dramatic works. So the humor in this poem, and it is funny, hinges on the analogy of an unperfect actor forgetting his lines to the speaker stammering through verbal expressions of his love, overcharged, he says, with burden of my own love's might. This poem, not one of the most popular sonnets, but it reminds us that Shakespeare was himself an actor and understood the pressures of theatrical performance as well as the pressure of composing poetry and plays. Sonnet number 30. So this is an elegant, poignant expression of regret, loneliness, and awareness of one's own mortality. This may be Shakespeare's finest expression of what is a recurrent theme of the sonnets. It is also noteworthy for its financial metaphors, for which Shakespeare shows a penchant elsewhere in his sonnets. For example, there's the expense of many a vanished sight, the sad account of forebenoted moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. These are the examples in this sonnet. The poet, at the end, finally accepts the consolation of friendship recollected in an earnest and subdued couplet. Sonnet number 65. So this is one that we'll put up on the screen here. So this sonnet is a really fine and confident expression of Shakespeare's belief that poetry is the most suitable monument for his love. It's more durable than metal or even stone. Only his verses, he says, can render his love and the object of his love immortal. And I love the paradox in the last line. Since brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality oversways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays? Oh, fearful meditation, where alack shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back, or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? Oh, none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright. So, sonnet number 73. This sonnet is a variation on the Carpe Diem or seize the day theme that one frequently encounters in Renaissance love poetry and would continue to be popular through the 17th century with poets like Andrew Marvell. Robert Herrick wrote a number of these. Typically, in these poems, the poet urges the surrender of chastity by emphasizing the fleeting nature of youth and beauty. In this poem, however, youth and beauty are apparently long gone. The poet is clearly writing in the twilight of his life. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. Of course, it is not sexual pleasure the poet is after, but a more sober, somber kind of love to solace him in his later years, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. So this sonnet shows Shakespeare's penchant for anaphora. This is a rhetorical device, the repetition of words and phrases. He does this in a lot of sonnets. He often does it to begin quatrains. So, for example, in this one, the second and third quatrains begin with the phrase, in me thou seest, as you can see in the one I quoted above. So that's something you can look for. Anaphora. Sonnet 76. So initially, the poet portrays himself in this sonnet in an anxious mood, doubting his own creative powers as he observes other writers' newfound methods and compound strange. I'm thinking of Michael Drayton's really strange later sonnets. Why write I still all one, ever the same, he asks. This inadequacy is meant with irony, of course, for in the final quatrain and couplet, he provides the answer to this question. It is because his love is durable and that his feelings do not change with fleeting fashions. He says, all my best is dressing old words new. What is steady and true never gets old, it never wears out. He says, for as the sun is daily new and old, so is my love still telling what is told. This sonnet is also a really good example of how the English form, the three-quatrain couplet form, can replicate the octave sestet structure of the Italian form. The volta at line 9, oh no, sweet love, I always write of you, introduces the solution to the dilemma presented in the first two quatrains, the octave. Sonnet 102. This sonnet also begins with the speaker acknowledging the diminishment of his poetic output, not in quality this time, but in quantity. He is not writing new poems at the rate he once did when he says, our love was new and then but in the spring. Provocatively, he is critical of poets whose productivity is tainted by, he believes, is tainted by crass commercial interests. That love is merchandised, he says, whose rich esteeming the owner's tongue doth publish everywhere. This is a striking passage. It seems to me a rather patrician attitude coming from a middle-class man towards an emergent class of professional poets. He reserves his poems rather for intimate audiences and earnest expression. He says, "Sweets grown common lose their dear delight. Therefore I sometime hold my tongue, because I would not dull you with my song." As he so often does, Shakespeare turns to the natural world for proof of his arguments. Here it is the nightingale who, he says, in summer's front doth sing, and stops her pipe in growth of riper days. Lines 7 and 8. This is one of my favorite sonnets, actually. So Sonnet 127, here we go. So this is the first of the so-called Dark Lady sonnets, although nowhere does Shakespeare describe her as such, never calls her a lady in the sonnets, does call her his mistress. "In the old age black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty's slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profane, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress' eyes are raven black, her brows so suited, and they mourners seem, at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so." So in this poem, Shakespeare is critical of the use of cosmetics, art's false borrowed face, he says, to make women appear unnaturally pale. He prefers the unfashionably dark but true complexion of his mistress, her dark eyes, he says, and this is a passage that echoes Sidney's praise of Stella's black eyes, are like mourners grieving the defacement of beauty by other women who plaster their faces with makeup. He says, slandering creation with a false esteem. In the couplet, he says that his mistress's the morning color of his mistress's eyes makes them even more beautiful, such that everyone praises her features now as the epitome of beauty. Now is black beauty's successive heir, he says in line 3. Sonnet 128. So this is a playful poem in which the speaker observes his mistress playing the harpsichord. A harpsichord was a kind of keyboard instrument that plucks rather than strikes the strings. A piano, the hammers strike the strings. The harpsichord would pluck them. And the speaker envies the key's intimacy with her fingers. He says, to be so tickled, his lips would change their state and situation with those dancing chips. O'er whom thy fingers walk with gentle gait, making dead wood more blessed than living lips. Elizabethan sonneteers, and Drayton in particular, had a knack for using the sonnet form to construct elaborate metaphors, and here Shakespeare proves himself more than capable. Number 130. So almost certainly Shakespeare's best-known sonnet and a direct assault on the Petrarchan tradition of the blazon, whose conventional language he acknowledges in sonnet number 106. And I'm going to quote number 106 here. Then in the blazon of sweet beauty's best, of hand, of foot, of lip, of eye, of brow, I see their antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty as you master now. There's a little bit of a kind of reverential acknowledgement of the Petrarchan tradition here, but in Sonnet 130, that's gone. Here, He turns the convention of the blazon completely on its head, hoping that his beloved will be more amenable to earnest expression than the hyperbolical flattery of the Petrarchan sonnet. And finally, sonnet number 146. Quite different from the others. Shakespeare's later sonnets show an increased and more intense preoccupation with sin and the afterlife. Number 146 is perhaps the best example of this trend and anticipates in certain respects the themes and tone of John Donne's Holy Sonnets, which would appear a couple decades later. Here we read the classic conflict between the soul, which is eternal, and a body subject to pollution and decay. Spiritual fortitude beset by earthly appetites. So the poet here confesses himself a sinner, starving his soul to feed his vanity. He says, "Why dost thou pine within and suffer dearth, painting thy outward walls so costly gay?" In the final quatrain, he expresses his determination to reverse course. "Then, soul, live thou upon thy servant's loss," that is the loss of his body, "and let that pine to aggravate thy store." So let your bodies suffer. Do without to focus on the rejuvenation of his spirit, of his soul. In exchange for earthly pleasure, he purchases life eternal. And I love this final couplet. "So shalt thou feed on death that feeds on men, and death once dead, there's no more dying then." And I think that's an appropriate sonnet to end with, and that concludes this presentation on Shakespeare's poetry.